I'm 32 years old and reside in a modest rural house. Up until right before bed, this evening was going pretty much as planned. I spent the entire day at home as I had the day off. Nothing out of the ordinary caught my attention. Around 9 p.m. I proceeded to my bedroom and prepared myself for sleep. I was trying to fall asleep while watching YouTube on my phone when I heard something. I put the video on hold. I heard a faint conversation coming from outside. At least two, perhaps possibly more. It was even more suspect because of the way they were speaking, which seemed to be an attempt to keep quiet. And to the best of my knowledge, this was the first time I've ever had someone trespass, since there were no sidewalks or other features close to my house, and I lived fairly distant from other houses. Anyone going this close had to be careful. I sat up in bed and attempted to hear what the boys were saying, but it was still too dim. I then stood up and moved to the window. All of the voices abruptly ceased speaking as soon as I approached it. Knowing that I had to be visible to whoever was out there sent a shiver down my spine. However, all I could see was my entire property covered in darkness. It was somewhat unnerving to consider all of their eyes gazing up at me through the window. I retreated swiftly. I sincerely hoped that this was all an accident. It's as if they were unaware that they had entered my property. However, why did they stay when they viewed my residence if such was the case? Why did the voices seem to be approaching the house more closely? After a few minutes of waiting, I approached the window once more, but this time I saw nothing. Then, in an attempt to see anything at all, I went downstairs and up to almost every window. It was really unnerving because of the worrying of not knowing what was happening or where they were. It was about half an hour later, when I first heard the men outside. I took a chance and opened the front door to listen and have a closer look. I opened the door, switched on the light, and went out onto the porch. I moved a little farther away from the door after a little while. Beyond the light, all I could hear was the breeze and the gentle sound of crickets, far too dark to distinguish any tree shapes or anything else. However, as I stood there, I experienced an overpowering emotion. I got quite suspicious and my eyes began to move all over. I had the impression that there were several eyes watching me from somewhere. I hurried back inside and shut the door. I had a gut feeling that something was going to happen. I'm not sure what it was, but I didn't want to know. The feeling subsided once I was inside and all the doors were secured, leading me to believe that it was only a sensation. I went back upstairs, got a drink of water, and let myself to unwind before returning to struggling to fall asleep in bed. It took some time, but I succeeded. I may have been asleep for several hours, but a loud crash from the corridor outside my bedroom startled me. With my pulse pounding, I leapt out of bed, ran to the door, and opened it. I peered into the corridor. The floor was covered in broken glass. A rock had been thrown directly through the window on the wall of the back hallway. I stood in disbelief for a few moments as I tried to figure out what this meant because I just couldn't believe it. Then I heard the voices once more. All of them are shouting demands at one another. There were also loud slams against the front door between their yelling. The entire house trembled under its weight. More windows were being broken by the forceful slams. I called 911 while I locked myself in the bedroom. I heard the horrifying sound of the door slamming open and several persons, while I was still on the call, sprinting inside the house. The bottom floor echoed with their footsteps. Some of them were even giggling, as I could hear. The operator on the telephone informed me that an officer would arrive in 5 minutes, but I didn't feel safe waiting because I knew the bunch had already gotten in and could probably simply tear down the bedroom door. I approached the window and pulled it open. This window provided access to the roof. Because the house was a ranch with slanted ceilings, I felt like I had no other option. Even though it was obviously forbidden to climb onto the roof from there due to the extreme hazard, I crawled out onto the roof, shut the window, and climbed even higher. The men began pounding on the bedroom door a minute later. Some of them even used jokingly nice voices as they yelled to open up. It was nauseating. After that, they just needed a couple blows to smash it open. Below me, their footsteps were dispersed. I could hear them get irritated after 30 seconds of searching. They likely double-checked each room as they went through the entire upper floor. I have no idea what was happening after that, but they stayed inside the house until they heard distant police sirens. The group then bolted back into the night and out of the house. I remained on the roof until the officers were inside and capable of bringing me down. It still amazes me that I managed to escape that. I was alone when a large bunch violently broke into my rural home in the middle of the night. What they were attempting to accomplish is beyond my comprehension. Although my house was essentially destroyed, nothing was truly missing, which regretfully, this indicates that they were undoubtedly searching for me. I'm not sure if they purposely picked my residence or if it was just a coincidence, but I doubt I will ever find out. Avery last year was going to a party with some friends for Halloween. A mutual friend's residence was to host the house party. However, the plans were derailed on the morning of Halloween. I had intended to stay up all night at the party, so I had already slept in and gotten up really late. I suppose I just had to spend time by myself at home if it didn't happen. Like everyone else, I went about my day and ended up spending the evening on the couch. Even though I wasn't sleeping, I was exhausted from being bored all day. Even though it was long beyond trick-or-treat time, after grabbing a blanket and some food, I watched an old horror film to kill time. The TV was in front of my couch, which was positioned along the wall in my living room. The kitchen was to the left, and my home's front windows were to the right. For seclusion, especially at night, I nearly always kept the drapes closed. However, I believed I saw something move between the gap and the curtains multiple times during the film. I would turn to look, but nothing was there, so I would put it out of my mind until it occurred again. Lastly, following the fifth or sixth in fact, I stood up to take a look. I was completely prepared to see nothing. I pushed back the curtains and peered out the window. I immediately noticed someone outside my house, not exactly outside the window, as I had assumed. This man was standing in front of my house on the street. He wore a black Halloween costume, but he was undoubtedly an adult, perhaps in his 30s. He was simply meandering across the area, approaching the sidewalk before turning around and crossing the street. He appeared to be intoxicated based on his behavior. I mean, I would have bet money that this guy was completely inebriated as he made his way home from a Halloween party. I noticed that it was 1 a.m. when I looked down at my watch. However, he didn't appear to be a threat or anything, and because he was too far away, I didn't believe he was the person I had been seeing moving around outside my window. I went back to the couch to finish the movie after closing the drapes. There was still space between the curtains even when they were completely closed, but I didn't notice any additional movement. In fact, after looking out the window, it piqued my interest. What I had been witnessing had ceased, but 10 minutes later, there was a knock on the door. I glanced around the room and briefly fixed my gaze on the door. That inebriated man had to be the culprit. I was nearly certain of it. Why in the world was he standing outside my front door? I stayed put in the hopes that he would simply go on and forget about it. However, he knocked once more. Just to make sure it was him, I went over. I looked out and saw the same man dressed in a dark costume. But there was a difference. He wasn't wobbling, stumbling, or doing anything like that. The man stared at the door while remaining immobile. His eyes were wide open and staring at the door handle, waiting for me to open it. Even through the peephole, I began to feel really uneasy. How in the world was he standing motionless and not fumbling around if he was intoxicated, particularly if he was as inebriated as he was 10 minutes earlier? It gave me the impression that he might not even be intoxicated. What was far more worrisome was that it might have just been some crazy person. I was considering whether or not to call the cops. However, the man left my doorway and walked away just as I was beginning to consider it. He appeared to be finished with whatever the hell he was doing as he walked down the sidewalk for as long as I could see. I walked out the door and returned to my seat. I basically had nothing for the next few hours. Something else worth mentioning. In the end, I drank some wine in the hopes that it would put me to sleep so I could simply go to bed. However, I was aware that if I attempted to fall asleep, I would only end myself sitting up in bed and gazing at the ceiling. Therefore, it wasn't worthwhile. However, I heard a tapping sound as I was scrolling through my phone on the couch. It came from the other side of the house. I stood up and moved a little closer, attempting to identify what it was and its precise source. Somewhere against the house, there was a dull tapping sound. I went into the family room after passing via the hallway. My gaze swept across the space, tracing the sound to the distant window. Then I noticed it. The shadow of a man tapping something against the window while standing just behind the glass. It was too dark to make out who he was or what he was carrying. I immediately went to the living room and dialed 911. The man continued, airily. While I was on the phone, I could still hear the slow tapping against the window. I returned to the hallway and peered out the window once again once the officers arrived, wanting to see if it was the same unsettling man from before. However, he stopped tapping, remained motionless for a few period, and then turned to go, indicating that he spotted me. I couldn't understand how it was possible, but the darkness made it impossible for me to see anything. Would be someone other than the previous man. Officers conducted a search of the area and recorded everything I said. I described the man who had stopped by earlier in great detail. Sadly, they were unable to locate him. 2 weeks later, the only further tip was from someone a few blocks away who had called the police for a nearly similar incident, witnessing an odd individual acting strangely and stalking their house. It's probably the same individual. However, no one knows what he was trying to achieve or may still be trying to do. I find myself wondering what would have happened if I had answered the door for him. I arrived home at 9:30 this morning from work. I quickly prepared a bowl of cereal for dinner that evening before heading straight to my room to set up my gaming system so I could stay up late and play games with the boys. They all worked later shifts as well, and it appears that we are a little behind schedule. After finishing my meal, I sat there and began playing video games on my own while I waited for them to connect. My phone began ringing while I was playing a game. When I looked at it, I thought it was one of my pals, but it was simply a random number. My phone rang again a few minutes after I let it ring, and it was the same number. In fact, I thought this was rather strange since scam calls often don't come from the same number twice in a row. As you can expect, they immediately called again for a third time after I rejected. I concluded that this couldn't be a hoax and that it had to be a friend using a different phone or something. I took it up and waited for them to speak before saying anything. However, there was a brief pause before I said hi. Nevertheless, nobody answered. However, I could hear wind in the background, so I knew it wasn't a deadline. There was undoubtedly someone on the other end of the call. After 15 seconds, I hung up, feeling a little uncomfortable. When my friends got online a few minutes later, I naturally asked them who was playing tricks on me. Initially, they acted as though it was them, but they genuinely had no idea what I was talking about, so it was obvious that they were just kidding. They acknowledged that it appeared to be a practical joke call, but what kind of practical joke is it to simply call and remain silent? We just started playing games and kept it a secret. Strangely, the calls stopped rolling in as soon as I was on call with my friends. After a few hours, I completely forgot that anything had even occurred. 2 a.m. we ultimately made the decision to end the evening. After we ended the call, I remained at my desk for a minute before my phone began to vibrate. I turned to see it was an SMS message. I noticed the text was from the same number that was phoning me, and that it was a photo before I even unlocked my phone. I clicked on the picture after opening my phone. I felt the blood pour from my face and my gut constrict. I was gaming at my desk in the photo, which was taken from the right, behind me only a few seconds ago. I turned and peered. There was nobody present. Seeing the window there and thinking, at least whatever the hell this picture was the one small consolation I felt. Most likely, it wasn't stolen from someone in my home. I rushed up to the window and peered out. Nobody could be seen. I closed the blinds after making sure the window was locked. I returned to my work and glanced at the image that remained up on my phone, still feeling quite uneasy. I was aware of how terrifying and terrible this was. I kept the picture and I hurriedly shared it in the group chat with my pals, hoping that one of them was playing a practical joke on me. But this time, none of them even made jokes. They were all telling me to either call the police or leave. As I silently opened my bedroom door and peered out into the rest of my house, my heart began to race. It was very quiet. For some reason, before I called the police, I really wanted to make sure the entire house was secure in case I was in imminent danger. However, I didn't even make it all the way down the hallway before turning the corner and seeing the front door. It was completely exposed. I'm not sure how, but it seemed as though I knew that I could see someone around the bend. I quickly ran back to my room and locked the door. Footsteps immediately emerged from down the corridor. However, he approached the opposite side of the door at a leisurely pace before knocking. The door handle moved, and I saw it. He knocked a couple more times after that. He didn't say anything. I made a police call, but it didn't take longer than 30 seconds. Abruptly, the man behind the door retreated, and I assume he simply left the house. I didn't receive the answers I was hoping for, but a few cops stopped by and conducted their inquiry. He texted and called a burner number, phone, didn't have a name or anything, and I never saw the man or had any idea who he was or why any of this occurred. Even now, there are moments when I can't help but feel suspicious because I wonder what would stop him from returning and doing the same thing. Anything worse or something else entirely.